Welcome to the MLB Slate Breakdown. I'm Jason Gilbo, JGilbo11. With me is Josh Shepardson at BChad50. Taking a look at the Thursday games here with a little bit of a split slate going on, some ugly weather to talk about, but overall it's really, the slate matches the weather because it's pretty ugly.
Yeah, pretty much. And this weird Thursday slate, there's not even necessarily agreement across the FanDuel and DraftKings as to what time some of these games should start, or the slates should start. For instance, the late slate on DraftKings includes the 6:10 start time. On FanDuel, starts at 7:05, and it's just a three-game slate. The early games, the weather just as brutal as you noted. We got weather concerns in New York and Washington. At the 6:10 start time, we got weather concerns in Cleveland, and then Baltimore at the 7:05 time. So a lot of weather to keep tabs on, a lot of games that could get washed out. It's early enough that, things could change, but the forecast, we're talking like greater than 75% chance of precipitation at basically all of these venues, according to Weather Underground. So a lot of weather to keep tabs on. That's going to be your weather warning for the podcast because we are so far out. There's not much more that Jason and I can do in terms of offering weather insight in terms of the likelihood of games getting in. Unless we magically get our meteorologist degrees here partway through the podcast. Not going to be really revisiting that. But the first game to talk about is at 3:35, White Sox at Oakland. Basically, if you're playing like the early slate, you're going to get those four games, or the middle slate. And it's going to be that Chicago White Sox Oakland game, Houston, New York, Miami, Washington, and the Dodgers and San Francisco. If you're on FanDuel, I believe you also get the Boston Cleveland game in that mid-range slate as well. But as far as the White Sox and Oakland go, you got Matt Latos on the hill and Kendall Graveman. As you pointed out in our show prep, 8.5 run over-under total in that one. Kind of eye-catching, but not necessarily a lot of names that you're saying, oh, yeah, he's a must-play, looking at that high total. Jose Abreu's in the mix. Adam Eaton's coming off of a good start to the season so far, and a nice table setter at the top facing a righty. So I do like him a bit. On the Oakland side of things, you mentioned Stephen Vogt, good name there. And up top, we got Josh Reddick's power, looks pretty good. So a handful of names in this one. Not a ton of names that you're super excited about, but guys that have some power, and you got to like that high over-under total.
Yeah, definitely. And I think with the weather situations coming out on the East Coast, if you are playing the early slate, this is your safety blanket. You look at Latos. Last season, kind of a shortened season for him, but he allowed a 344 WOBA to lefties. So mention all those Oakland left-handers is a pretty good spot for him. And they all come at a decent price tag, which is nice. Billy Burns is another one leading off there, so he can grab you some stolen bases. Reddick has that power. Outside of that, you're looking at the White Sox side. Obviously, the big boppers up front within the first, four hitters or so. Outside of that, not much I'm looking at from this game, and I'm definitely probably going to be staying away from the starters there.
Yeah, good call on staying away from the starters. And Todd Frazier is another name that we should throw out there. One of those high-order boppers that you talked about with Chicago. Houston, New York, the weather looks dreadful, but if this one does get in, Fiers has maybe some GPP appeal because he can strike some batters out. But, man, being a righty at Yankee Stadium against those lefties, last night Colin McHugh kind of illustrated how dangerous that can be. The table setters there got to be in play as long as the weather gets in. Brett Gardner, very good against righties at home. Jacoby Ellsbury right up there in front of all the mashers in the heart of that order. Guys like A-Rod, Teixeira have the kind of power, and Fiers, low ground ball rate, doesn't play well at Yankee Stadium, so grabbing some of the power hitters makes sense there from the Yankee side of things. On the Houston side of things, you want any lefty that they get in the lineup against Nathan Eovaldi, Jason Castro, Colby Rasmus, Preston Tucker. Nathan Eovaldi just gets lit by a left-handed batter. So, again, you also get the left-handed batter park factors at Yankee Stadium, which is always a plus. He is very tough on righties, so guys like Altuve, not crazy about him, even on the short slate with, limited superstars to choose from. Not a huge fan of him, not necessarily a huge fan of George Springer. But Carlos Correa, I'm a huge fan of him against anyone at this point. He's locked in to start the season. Multi-homer game yesterday, had 4 hits, stole a couple bases, and hit a homer in the season opener. I don't know what planet Correa's from. Maybe planet Earth is his planet, and we're just all living on it. I'm not really sure, but If that game gets in, it's going to be hard to turn away from him, even with some other options at shortstop like Corey Seager in that Dodgers game. Correa is just so good. He brings power. He brings speed. He makes a lot of contact. He's got a great ballpark for hitting in today. Going to be really hard to fade him, especially when he's going to get that massive ownership boost that comes with that hot start and people chasing points.
Yeah, I mean, and with the pitchers on today's slate, I am looking for some power and looking for some safety. And kind of much like last night, you know, there was only a handful of pitchers that actually did well. So you maybe were on the outside looking in as far as that goes, and Correa actually carried you the way. And I'm looking for him to do the same on today's slate. And even though Eovaldi is tough on right-handers, Correa, like you mentioned, he's just from another planet or this planet. And he's really just your top shortstop in that early slate. And I think if weather concerns, it's easy to kind of spin down going into that Dodgers and San Francisco games with both their shortstops in play.
Yeah. Next up, we got Adam Conley against Tanner Roark in the Washington-Miami game. It's another one that we talked about weather concerns here. But if this one gets in, Conley's an interesting name. Struck out better than 22% of batters he faced last year as a starter. Really exceeded any expectations. Was not much of a prospect. Looked like a guy who could be a swing guy. Start some, relieve some. But has pitched quite well, pitched himself into the rotation in the spring, which is always good to see. I mean, I don't take springs too seriously, but if you got a guy who really wasn't necessarily considered a lock by any stretch to get in the rotation, pitched his way in, gotta like that he's kind of already in that battle mode right away, in good form. As far as Roark goes, doesn't miss many bats. There are some decent bats in that Miami lineup, so not a fan of him. You got to strike out more batters or do a little bit of something more than Roark. He's just a guy who relies on moving the ball around and getting soft contact. And while that may work in reality at times and did in the 2014 season when he was starting, it's not something you want to get super excited about in daily games. As far as the hitters go on the Miami side of things, I mean, we got Giancarlo Stanton, you got Justin Boyd, he can hit for some power. D. Gordon up the top of the order is always in play, especially since Altuve, I guess Eovaldi's not really a matchup that you and I are fans of. On the Washington side of things, it is lefty-lefty, but Bryce Harper is in play against everyone. Ryan Zimmerman hits left-handed pitching pretty hard, and then Jason Worth hiding in the 5-hole hits lefties pretty hard. But again, this one looks like in terms of the weather, one of the worst ones out there. So do keep tabs on that. But yeah, not crazy about Roark. Do like Conley some. Any other names you want to throw out there?
I think you touched on them. I mean, I'm looking at that Marlins side. Of course, if this game stays dry and gets in, you're looking at guys like Yelich. I think is an interesting pivot, a little different name there. As you mentioned, Roark, just not a big strikeout guy. The more I think the weather's going to throw me off, but if we're looking weather aside, Conley actually not a bad name to really toss out there. Although small sample size last year, right-handed bats just had an 18% line drive rate off of them. Pretty soft hard ball rate as well. So sure, you can see, looking at a small sample size, but out of today's slates, I mean, he kind of draws a favorable matchup. Washington really isn't that strong of a lineup to get through outside of, really Bryce Harper.
Yeah, and I mean the game total is only 8. He's only a small betting underdog, so definitely like Conley in that one. Moving on to the Dodgers and Giants, small total at AT&T Park, but I'm not crazy about Alex Wood coming off of a bad spring. Didn't pitch well with the Dodgers last year. Really, the only place that he's had a nice strikeout rate, as you and I talked about before the show, is at home with the Braves. I know on the Fantasy Baseball Cafe podcast last year with RJ, he brought up maybe the batter's eye there in Atlanta. As an Atlanta fan, I feel like he's probably heard some theories and maybe has some idea as to what was going on. But I mean, we've seen Wood and we've seen Teheran, same story. Both guys can strike guys out at Atlanta, but really don't do anything else anywhere else. So I'm not sure what to make of his strikeout rate going forward as a member of the Dodgers. Maybe it just is a matter of him being more comfortable at home than on the road, and we'll see that strikeout rate pick up with Dodgers. But he's on the road today anyway, so it doesn't really matter. The righties in the Giants lineup that you're going to like are Matt Duffy a little bit, but Buster Posey and Hunter Pence a lot. Posey kills lefties. Gotta love him. this is another one where weather really isn't a concern, so it's going to be one of those safety blanket games like you mentioned with the A's and White Sox. On the Dodgers side of things, they're going to be facing Jake Peavy. Peavy not a guy that pitches really deep into games anymore, and the Giants have enough options at the back of the bullpen. I don't think you're going to see him get to go through that lineup more than maybe twice before they go to that bullpen. Which means his upside is limited. It does have a low total, so maybe you do consider throwing him into a GPP or something. But there are some lefties in that lineup that look good. Adrian Gonzalez, Corey Seager. Chase Utley's been hitting leadoff, so he is a nice punt play at the second base position. And then in the outfield, you and I talked about it. Carl Crawford, I mean, he's a lefty. He draws that favorable right-handed matchup. But as you put it before the show, 2 to 3 at-bat guy with the way that they're bringing in these pinch hitters late in games, and the fact that he hits down order, so you don't get that lineup turnover and that extra at bat with him. So other than that, really not loving any guys in this. It is at AT&T Park. The total isn't very high, 7.5 runs, so not a lot of scoring expected. But PV small favorite, so maybe consider him in some games, just because the pitching options are pretty dreadful on the slate and the weather concerns.
Yeah, and this is one of those games where, in any other ballpark, maybe you see an 8.5 total, but because it's an AT&T, you're going to see it come down a little bit. And I think this is a game where, sure, there may not be a ton of runs, but I think, you're looking at these lineups and they're going to get their shares of hits, so it's not going to be an attractive big power outing like you're going to see in the East Coast games if they get going. But they're definitely going to get their shares of hits, maybe put together a few runs. It's going to probably be a low-scoring slate anyway, and I think they're going to chip in and should get the job done with all those names that you mentioned.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Moving on to the later games, and I guess this one's still going to be part of that early slate on FanDuel, but part of the late slate on DraftKings. So know your site, know your games, I guess, is the point here. This is another one East Coast game with some other concerns, but it's Joe Kelly against Danny Salazar. Love Danny Salazar, even though Boston's gotten to Carlos Carrasco, plus some runs on the board, and Corey Kluber earlier this season. Salazar has an electric arsenal, ranked, I believe, 15th in swinging strike rate last year. So even though the Red Sox don't strike out much, does have the type of stuff that can put up strikeouts against any lineup anyway. Joe Kelly on the other side of things, you and I are in agreement. Nice SP2 on DraftKings. Game is a low total of just 7.5 runs, and has a reverse platoon split that has been going on for a few years now, so it looks like it's more than just a single season outlier sort of deal. Lefties don't hit them hard, and your best bats in that Cleveland lineup, your top bats, top of the order, guys like Francisco Lindor, Carlos Santana, Jason Kipnis, all going to be batting left-handed, whether they're lefties or switch hitters, and looking to bat lefty against a righty. So that plays into Kelly's favor. Not a big strikeout guy, has that electric arm, but really doesn't use the secondaries to pick up strikeouts. But again, hate to beat a dead horse, but the pitching on the slate is not very good. So even without those strikeouts, if Kelly can get you a quality start, six innings, 7 innings, just a few earned, and pick up the W, or even just not get shelled and get you a handful of points, really, this is going to be a bat heavy. If you pick the right bats, you're going to cash sort of slate. So really like the savings he gives you on DraftKings by using him as an SP2 there, and just loading up on bats. On the Boston bat side of things, I think David Ortiz is a really nice pivot off of Anthony Rizzo, or the popular pivot, or who I think will be the popular pivot, Chris Davis. So you're looking at David Ortiz, who crushes righties. Salazar has some home run issues throughout his career, especially against lefties last year. ISO 200 exactly. So he can give up some long balls, and progressive field, very favorable for left-handed batters. Plays neutral for home runs, but enhances doubles, triples, and runs scored. So good ballpark for him. Maybe look at Jackie Bradley Jr. down order. He does have some power. You'd be just chasing a home run in the Danny Salazar homeritis showing up today. But the rest of the lineup, not a huge fan of. This is actually a good slate for shortstop, so I don't necessarily like Xander Bogaerts in that righty-righty matchup. Maybe on a different slate where he's the only good bat, you consider him. But on this one, I think we've got some other ones, especially on FanDuel, where you got Seager and Correa, and even in the late slate, it's a punt for me basically on DraftKings.
Yeah, I'm definitely in agreement there. I think Ortiz is the nice pivot. I mean, the ball's jumping off his bat here early in the season. Already a couple of homers, and as you mentioned, I mean, progressive field, decent for lefties. And talking about lefties, I think Joe Kelly is my favorite SP2 behind obviously Lackey, who I'll be pairing him up with in that late slate. And I mean, overall, I mean, you look at last season, 0.64 home runs per nine lefties, very solid. The hard ball or the hard ball batted ball sets are a little scary at times with Kelly, but outside of that, I mean, you're dealing with a lot of starters that there's much more risk than Joe Kelly, which is hard at times. But outside of that, I think he's your safest option behind Lackey there. And as far as the bats go, no one really on that Cleveland side that I like. Vegas projects this one to be pretty low. I don't see many right-handers getting to him. I don't see many guys I want to even take a shot on, like Marlon Byrd or even Rajai Davis, the only other two notable guys that could do any damage off of him. And as you mentioned, Ortiz is probably my only hitter that I would take from this game. And I kind of like the JBJ call just because it's different. He's a little bit cheaper. Maybe he hits one into the gap. He can run for days. That is an option with him.
Yeah, and the fact that he's hitting down order is going to immediately turn some people off of him too. But the fact that he's got some pop in his stick, you get that extra base hit at the bottom of the order, and that's good enough to pay his salary off at both sides. Next up, we got Minnesota at Baltimore at 7:05. This is the last really weather-concerned game. Phil Hughes against Ubaldo Jimenez. Phil Hughes, that fastball, not so much a fastball anymore. Lost 2 ticks on it last year. There's actually some pitch FX data at baseball for him in the spring, and it's not favorable. Looks like he's still sitting at just barely over 90 miles an hour. Last year, he was not striking anyone out with that 90-mile-an-hour fastball, and that means that the guys that do have some strikeout issues, Chris Davis, Pedro Alvarez, Jonathan Schoop, they become much more attractive against a pitcher who can't miss bats since they can do so much damage when they put the bat on the ball. Chris Davis is my favorite pivot off of Anthony Rizzo, but he's probably going to be the most popular pivot off of him too. On DraftKings, you can use him in the outfield and still use Rizzo or still use Ortiz, so I do like that quite a bit. Don't need to tell you how big his power is. Don't really need to tell you how great Camden Yards is for left-handed batters, but in case you've been living under a rock, those things are true. Pedro Alvarez dropped into that lineup. He's basically Chris Davis light, but not too light. I mean, he's directly behind him on Baseball Heat Maps average home run and fly ball distance chart last year, ranking 3rd. So guys hit monster shot. Those two hit monster shots, and Hughes just doesn't have the stuff to get beyond their bats. But Jonathan Schoop is a guy that I really like in this one, especially on FanDuel, where you only get 4 players from the same team, and that includes the pitcher. So if you're going to use John Lackey, it means you only get 3 bats from the Cubbies. Really loaded outfield. Anthony Rizzo is a guy you have to use, at least in cash games. Obviously, you can be contrarian in GPPs too, but that means Ben Zobrist is kind of on that cut line for whether he's included in your stacks or dropped from them. Jonathan Schoop, a nice alternative, big power, facing a guy who struggles with right-handed batters. Hughes has a reverse platoon split, actually more giving to righties than lefties. Schoop does too. Granted, Schoop's is a very small sample size, but speaking of guys with reverse platoon splits, Manny Machado has made a career of it thus far. Hammers righties. Not that he didn't hammer lefties last year, but a guy who has a gap that very much favors hitting righties. So really love Machado. He's the best play at third base tonight, but salary considerations could make it a toss-up at the hot corner between him and a forthcoming third baseman we'll be talking about. And then one other name on Baltimore that I'll highlight is Matt Wieters for them. As giving as Hughes was to righties, was giving to lefties as well, like catcher. Going to get that left-handed batter park factor boost at Camden Yards, but also going to get that matchup favor boost facing Hughes. On the Minnesota side of things, maybe you consider Dozier chasing some power because Camden Yards is good for pop. Ubaldo Jimenez, also GPP consideration just because the pitching slate is so bad. And when he's good, he can at least give you a quality start, which today, that's good enough. You get a quality start and you get the right bats that you're cashing. And And then Miguel Sano, outfield eligible on FanDuel, third base eligible on DraftKings. He's a pivot in either scenario. As you mentioned, those Cubs outfielders, that's where people are going to be going. So if you grab somebody that's not a Cubs outfielder, you're already making a bit of a contrarian play. At third base, you got Machado and Adrian Beltre mostly on both sites or on DraftKings. So that leaves Miguel Sano priced between the two, probably going to get lower ownership. But Jimenez giving to righties last year, he's kind of had a roller coaster ride for Woba's allowed to righties throughout his career. So if it's a bad year for Jimenez, he can certainly give up some contact and some numbers to righties. And Sano hammered right-handed pitching in his debut last year. Other than that, not really looking at any guys in that Minnesota lineup. So that those are the guys that I'm targeting in that contest.
Yeah, I'm definitely with you there. And Ubaldo Jimenez, he's a great GPP play just because, God, he's so up and down. But, I mean, when he gets that sinker working, it's absolutely filthy. And he had it working at times last year. He put together a couple months, but then he put together a month later where he just looked completely awful. As far as Phil Hughes goes, he struggled completely in all in 2015, but a lot more on the road, an ERA over 5, a lot of 374 WOBA compared to a 324 at home. Camden Yards, one of the greater ballparks for hitters. I mean, I like all these guys, and to mention Adam Jones, I mean, his price tag on FanDuel
Definitely
is just a nice pivot away because you're looking at Schwarber 3,400, Sano right there at 33. You're looking at Fowler 31. Jones sitting there right in the middle, and I think he is going to be the contrarian move. And this guy who can go yard, especially off a guy like Phil Hughes, who just allows a ton of homers. And I mean, you mentioned everyone that I like: Machado, Davis, Alvarez is a solid GPP play, and probably going to be the lower owned. Well, definitely will be the lower owned out of those names there.
Yep, and good call on Adam Jones. I mean, he's sandwiched right in between those boppers and Manny Machado, so he's got both runs scored upside and RBI upside with the tape setters in front of him. Moving on to Arizona, we got Chicago, the Cubbies at Arizona at 940, John Lackey versus Ruby De La Rosa, and welcome to Stack City here in the desert. All those Cubs lefties, just get them in your lineup. Mix and match them: Hayward, Fowler, Rizzo, Schwarber, even Miguel Montero comes into play. Granted, on FanDuel, he's almost a contrarian play because you can only get the 4 Cubs hitters or 3 Cubs hitters on Lackey. So if you're using Montero, probably getting slightly lower ownership just because of the roster limitations. DraftKings, because you can get 6 guys in there, he'll have some ownership and should, honestly. Makes for interesting wraparound stacks if you're going to use him. Even if he bats in front of the pitcher, you figure use him and then get the top of that order. So the 2 left-handed or the switch hitting and left-handed bat at the top of the order might get some things there. Not really using the righties from the Cubbies though. So that means Addison Russell and Chris Bryant. There's just too much talent at third base tonight. De La Rosa is tough on righties, but he is so giving to left-handed batters. You really got to get those Cubs lefties in there. And the ballpark factors at Arizona are great. Biggest total of the night is in the desert. Cubbies favorites there, so they're expected to do the heavy lifting for the scoring in that contest. Lackey coming off of a career year, but ZRA estimators really in line with his last 2 years. He's a mid-threes pitcher, even though he had that sub-3 ERA last year. And that's pretty darn good on the slate. Struck out just under 20% of batters he faced, so doesn't have a ton of strikeout upside, but has more than guys like Phil Hughes and Ubaldo Jimenez, or maybe roughly the same strikeout upside as Jimenez. And but he's backed by that offense. He should be in a really good position to get that W. That Diamondbacks lineup just not nearly as terrifying without A.J. Pollock in it. But the names from their lineup that I'm considering is really name in their lineup that I'm considering, and that's David Peralta, hitting behind Goldie, left-handed. Like gave up over a 320 WOBA to left-handed batters last year, and Peralta really came into his own last year. I mean, he had a nice rookie season, definitely above average against righties, but made advancements across the board. Plate discipline, strikeout rate, power, all the numbers went up across the board for him. So really good play, and because the outfield is so loaded and everybody's looking at the other side of things, might have a lower ownership than he probably should. And the fact that Lackey's going to be your most popular pitcher, we know that it's a no-no to use your hitters against pitchers. Granted, in this case, a little overlap with Lackey and Peralta I can understand. It is only a 3-game slate on FanDuel, so that is bound to happen in some cases. But if you're not using Lackey, all the more reason to use Peralta and try to be a little bit different.
Yeah, definitely. And with Lackey being the top pitcher, I think Peralta's the lone name in the desert that I'm looking at on that Arizona side. I mean, Lackey's a guy I really like tonight. You're looking at last year, he did have his career year. And only 4 times out of 33 starts did he allow 4 earned runs or more, which is very impressive. So not a real big blow-up concern. The only blow-up he really had last season was that core start where he allowed 8 in about 2 innings or so. So, I mean, he's a veteran guy, and I think that's what you're looking for tonight, who can just – maybe he allows 7-8 hits or so, but he's a guy who can control his damage, get out of innings, which you like. And you don't see that with all the other guys on the slate. So that's why I'm definitely leaning on Lackey, and he's a pretty easy guy to grab a W tonight.
Yeah, that consistency is huge on a slate where there just aren't consistent arms. So I'm with you. The last game, we got Derek Holland and the Rangers at the Angels and Hector Santiago. That game starts at 10:05. Couple bats on the Rangers side of things that I like. Adrian Beltre, we've been talking about him kind of secretively throughout the show. Haven't really gone in depth on him, but guy kills lefties. Hector Santiago, left-handed pitcher that gives up a ton of fly balls, gives up a ton of hard hit balls to right-handed batters. Also gives up, as you'd expect, a favorable WOBA to right-handed batters too, and Beltre has a track record of just hammering lefties. Interestingly, his last 3-year numbers against left-handed pitchers in terms of WOBA, ISO, and WRC plus actually line up favorably with Machado's breakout numbers last year against right-handed pitchers. So guy that's really on par with Machado. Maybe has a slightly tougher pitching matchup, but not much. The biggest knock on Beltre when comparing him directly to Machado is that he's playing in pitcher-friendly Los Angeles as opposed to Camden Yards in Baltimore. But the difference in price definitely closes that gap a little bit, makes it a lot easier to get some of these Cubbies bats in there together and stack them. So Beltre is kind of your co-chalk play at third base with Machado. Don't have the weather concerns in that game. And then Robinson Chirinos, he's my favorite play at catcher tonight. Cheap, doesn't take up one of your Cubs roster spots, which is good. And hammers left-handed pitching, ISO over 200 against lefties the last 2 years. And as I noted, Santiago, big fly ball rate allowed to right-handed batters. So if you got a guy that hits for power, really nice when you don't have to work so hard to lift the ball against that opposing pitcher. Santiago gives up a ton of fly balls. The Angels, one hitter that I'm looking at, and it's really only a single bullet or a couple bullets, GPP only, and it's Mike Trout. Big shocker. I mean, he is the game's superstar of superstars, and on a short slate, he's going to get that ownership boost just because people are going to slot in the guys that they know, some of the noobs that is. And but Trout, I mean, he's earned some consideration in GPP rosters on a short slate like this, just because his numbers against lefty are otherworldly. Big power, hammers those guys, and if Holland's changeup isn't working like it wasn't last year, Holland will have no answer for Trout. But as far as Holland goes, you and I are in agreement, so I'll let you discuss him a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking at this Angels lineup, and I mean, they've been dreadful in that Cubs series. They weren't that good last year, especially against left-handed pitching. And I mean, you're looking at guys like Yunel Escobar and Daniel Nava going up front, and then you got Cole Calhoun, who slips way back in the lineup, who can't hit lefties. If you look at Holland, who can work around Trout. I think he's easily a top option on such a small slate, a decent strikeout rate. And, I do think the Rangers are a pretty good favorite to get a win tonight, although Vegas doesn't show it. But in comparison to the other names there, he's definitely worth a look. I mean, overall, I think GPP-wise, I think he's your third option just because of Ubaldo possibly being in a rain-out game if that's the case. But to touch on Santiago real quick, I don't think this game's going to be incredibly high scoring, but I do think that picking those guys you named, especially Chirinos behind the plate, Beltre is a nice pivot. Santiago, better at home, obviously, just because of the pitcher park. Early on in the years, he's also solid just because the weather's a little bit cooler. But once things heat up, once he gets on the road, he's giving up homers left and right, gives up a ton of extra base hits just because he can't keep the ball on the ground. So I think you're looking at like a 4-3, 5-2 type of game tonight, and so I think you got to be really choosy with this game. But it also, I mean, you could be just playing a West Coast only game just based on possible weather concerns.
Yeah, total agreement there.
So, yeah. That's going to wrap things up here with the MLB breakdown. Check out dailyfantasycafe.com for all our great tools and content.